The bustling halls of Roosevelt High School were alive with the usual Monday morning chaos as students rushed to their first period classes. Among them was 16-year-old David Johnson, a bright sophomore with dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer. Despite maintaining a perfect 4.0 GPA and being part of the school's prestigious STEM program, David often felt like an outsider in Mrs. Thompson's advanced physics class, not because of the challenging material, but because of something far more troubling. Mrs. Thompson, a veteran teacher of 25 years, had a reputation for being strict and traditional. However, beneath her professional exterior lurked prejudices that would soon come to light in ways she never expected. While she treated most students with cool professionalism, her interactions with David often carried subtle undertones of bias that didn't go unnoticed by his classmates. That morning, as David confidently raised his hand to answer a complex question about quantum mechanics, Mrs. Thompson's response would change everything. Instead of acknowledging his contribution, she let out an exaggerated sigh and said, "I'm looking for serious answers from students who actually studied the material." The classroom fell silent as the implications of her words hung heavy in the air. David's hand remained raised, his voice steady despite the hurt building in his chest. "I did study, Mrs. Thompson." The answer involved Schrödinger's equation and its application to particle behavior. His response was textbook perfect, but Mrs. Thompson had already turned away, calling on another student. What happened next would become the talk of Roosevelt High for months to come. Chen Wei, a usually quiet exchange student sitting next to David, stood up. His voice shook slightly, but his words rang clear. "Mrs. Thompson, David's answer was correct. I've been studying with him in the library every day after school. He knows this material better than anyone in class." Other students began nodding in agreement. Riley Martinez, the class president, spoke up next. "David helped me understand last week's homework. He explains things better than," she caught herself, but the message was clear. Mrs. Thompson's face flushed as she realized the entire class was witnessing her bias. She attempted to regain control of the situation, but the damage was done. Unknown to her, several students had already pulled out their phones, documenting the incident. Among them was Priya Patel, editor of the school newspaper, who recognized this moment as much more than typical classroom drama. The next 40 minutes of class passed in tense silence, but the real story was just beginning. As the bell rang, instead of rushing out, students lingered, gathering around David in a show of solidarity. The whispered conversations and determined looks exchanged between classmates suggested that this incident wouldn't be brushed aside like so many before it. David remained composed, gathering his books with the same dignity he'd shown throughout the confrontation. His father, Dr. Johnson, a respected neurosurgeon at the local hospital, had always taught him that success was the best response to prejudice. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that her actions that morning would not only challenge her position at Roosevelt High but would spark a movement that would transform the school's approach to diversity and inclusion forever. As David walked out of class that day, surrounded by supportive classmates, he couldn't have known that this painful moment would lead to profound changes not just for him, but for every student who would walk through Roosevelt High's doors in the years to come. The wheels of justice were already in motion, driven by a generation of students who refused to remain silent in the face of discrimination. By lunchtime, the video of Mrs. Thompson's discriminatory behavior had spread throughout Roosevelt High like wildfire. Students huddled around cafeteria tables, phones in hand, sharing their own experiences and discussing what they'd witnessed. The incident in physics class had become a catalyst for a long-overdue conversation about prejudice within the school's walls. Priya, still working on her draft for the school newspaper, sat with her usual group of friends, including David. "This isn't just about today," she said, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. "It's about every student who's ever felt diminished in a classroom because of who they are." David picked at his lunch, uncomfortable with the attention but moved by the support. "I just wanted to answer a physics question," he said quietly. "I didn't expect all of this." His phone buzzed continuously with messages of support from classmates and even students he'd never spoken to before. Chen Wei, who had first stood up for David, joined their table with a determined look on his face. "My parents always taught me that staying silent in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem," he said. "In my old school in Shanghai, I saw similar things happen. Nobody ever spoke up. I promised myself I would be different." The conversation was interrupted when Riley Martinez rushed over, still catching her breath. "You guys need to see this," she said, holding up her phone. The local community Facebook group was already discussing the incident, with parents expressing their outrage and calling for action. Someone had shared the video, and it was gaining traction beyond the school community. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Thompson sat alone, her untouched lunch growing cold as she stared at an email from Principal Richardson requesting an immediate meeting after school. Other teachers avoided eye contact, creating a bubble of isolation around her table. Only Mr. Rodriguez, the Spanish teacher and teachers' union representative, approached her to quietly discuss the situation. The afternoon classes buzzed with an electric energy as students continued sharing the story. In David's other classes, teachers made pointed efforts to call on him, almost overcompensating in their attempt to show support. But David noticed something more significant. Other students who had previously been quiet were now raising their hands more often, as if the morning's events had broken some invisible barrier. After school, a group of 30 students gathered in the library, led by Priya and the school newspaper team. What started as a meeting to discuss the article evolved into something bigger. Students from various grades shared similar experiences they'd had, not just with Mrs. Thompson, but throughout their academic careers. "We need to do more than just report this," said Alex Kumar, a junior class representative. "We need to create real change." The group began drafting a proposal for the school board, outlining specific instances of bias they'd witnessed and suggesting concrete solutions. In Principal Richardson's office, the meeting with Mrs. Thompson was not going well. The principal, a former civil rights attorney who had transitioned to education mid-career, laid out the severity of the situation. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained, her voice firm but professional. "The video shows a pattern of behavior that directly contradicts our school's values and educational mission." Mrs. Thompson's attempts to defend herself only dug a deeper hole. "I've been teaching longer than most of these students have been alive," she protested. "I've never had a complaint before." But Principal Richardson's tablet told a different story as she scrolled through emails from parents and former students, all sharing similar experiences that had gone unreported. Outside the principal's office, Dr. Johnson arrived, having left the hospital early after receiving calls from other concerned parents. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity his son had shown that morning, but the concern in his eyes was evident. As he waited to meet with Principal Richardson, several teachers stopped to express their support and share positive stories about David's contributions to their classes. The story took an unexpected turn when local news vans appeared in the school parking lot. Someone had tipped them off about the viral video and the growing community response. Principal Richardson's secretary was fielding calls from reporters, while the school district's public relations team scrambled to craft an appropriate response. By evening, what had started as a classroom incident had evolved into a movement. Social media was ablaze with #JusticeAtRoosevelt hashtags, and students were organizing a peaceful demonstration for the following morning. Parents were calling each other, planning to attend the next school board meeting en masse. David sat in his family's living room, watching as his story played on the evening news. His mother, a civil rights attorney, was already drafting letters to the school board and Department of Education. But it was his father's words that resonated most deeply. "Son, sometimes the hardest moments in our lives become the ones that create the most important changes for others." As night fell over the city, different groups prepared for the next day in their own ways. Students coordinated their peaceful protest through group chats. Parents drafted emails and made phone calls. Teachers struggled with how to address the situation in their classes. And somewhere in her empty classroom, Mrs. Thompson faced the reality that tomorrow would bring consequences she never expected when she let her biases show that morning. The next morning, Roosevelt High School awoke to a sea of students wearing blue, David's favorite color. The spontaneous show of solidarity had spread through social media overnight, transforming the school's hallways into a powerful visual statement. Even teachers and staff members had joined in, many sporting blue ties, scarves, or blazers. As students arrived, they were met by local news crews setting up their equipment near the school entrance. Principal Richardson, who had barely slept after hours of emergency meetings with the school board, stood at the front steps, ensuring media remained at an appropriate distance while students entered the building safely. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with purpose. Priya and her newspaper team had worked late into the night, producing a special edition that went beyond just reporting the incident. They had compiled years of student testimonials, statistics on educational bias, and expert interviews with education equality advocates. The papers were stacked neatly on tables in the main hallway, disappearing almost as quickly as they were put out. David arrived with his parents, overwhelmed by the sight that greeted them. Dr. Johnson placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder as they walked through the crowd of supporters. Students they didn't even know approached to share their own stories of facing discrimination, each account reinforcing the importance of this moment. The morning's assembly, hastily organized by the administration, became a turning point. Principal Richardson took the stage, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in education. "Yesterday, we witnessed something that should never happen in any classroom," she began. "But we also saw something beautiful, students standing up for what's right, supporting each other, and demanding better from their school." She announced immediate actions: mandatory sensitivity training for all staff, the formation of a student-led diversity and inclusion council, and a comprehensive review of the school's hiring and training practices. But it was what happened next that no one expected. Mrs. Thompson stepped onto the stage. The auditorium fell silent. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. "I've spent the night watching that video of myself, over and over," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw something I didn't want to see, my own prejudices, built up over years, hurting a student who deserved better. I'm deeply sorry, not just to David, but to every student I may have hurt with my biases." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Then, from somewhere in the back, a single pair of hands started clapping. Others joined in, not in celebration, but in recognition of the difficult step she had taken. Mrs. Thompson announced she would be taking a leave of absence to pursue intensive bias training and education in cultural competency. As the assembly dispersed, the school board president arrived for an emergency meeting with Principal Richardson and parent representatives. In the conference room, Dr. Johnson spoke not just as David's father, but as a member of the community. "This isn't about punishment," he explained. "It's about transformation. How do we ensure every student feels valued, respected, and heard?" Meanwhile, in the school library, student leaders from various clubs and organizations gathered to draft what they called the Roosevelt Pledge, a comprehensive set of guidelines for creating an inclusive educational environment. Chen Wei, drawing from his international perspective, suggested incorporating successful practices from schools worldwide. The local education board took notice. Representatives visited throughout the day, sitting in on classes and talking with students. What they found wasn't just a school in crisis, they discovered a community actively working to transform itself. The students' mature, measured response to the incident impressed everyone who witnessed it. By afternoon, something remarkable was happening in the classrooms. Teachers began opening their lessons with discussions about respect, diversity, and the importance of speaking up against injustice. In AP Literature, they analyzed poems about courage and standing up for what's right. In history, they examined past movements that had created positive change in schools. The story caught the attention of national education blogs and news outlets. Requests for interviews poured in, but David and his family carefully chose to speak only with journalists who wanted to focus on the broader issues rather than sensationalize the incident. "This isn't about one teacher or one student," David explained to a reporter. "It's about creating a better education system for everyone." Social media continued to amplify the story, but in unexpected ways. Students from other schools began sharing their own experiences and asking for advice on creating change in their communities. The Justice at Roosevelt hashtag evolved into Education for All, spreading across the country. After school, a peaceful gathering in the gymnasium drew hundreds of community members. Parents, teachers, students, and local leaders came together to discuss practical steps forward. The meeting wasn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame, it focused on solutions, understanding, and healing. As evening approached, David sat in his favorite spot in the school library, trying to process the whirlwind of events. Priya found him there, working on his physics homework despite everything happening around him. "You know," she said, sitting down beside him, "someday we'll tell our kids about how one quiet morning in physics class changed an entire school." David looked up from his textbook, a small smile crossing his face. "Maybe," he replied, "but the real story isn't about that morning. It's about what happened afterward, how everyone chose to respond. That's what matters." Outside the library windows, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. Students were still leaving the building in groups, many wearing their blue shirts, all of them forever changed by the events of the past 2 days. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, there was hope that from this difficult moment, something truly meaningful was beginning to grow. A week after the incident, Roosevelt High School was a different place. The initial wave of media attention had subsided, but the commitment to change had only grown stronger. The newly formed Student Diversity Council, with representatives from every grade level, was meeting for the first time in the school library. David sat among his peers, no longer just the student from the viral video, but a voice for change. The council included students from all backgrounds. Chen Wei brought his international perspective, Priya shared her experience as a second-generation immigrant, and Riley contributed insights from her role as class president. Even students who had previously stayed quiet on such issues found their voices. "We need to think beyond just addressing obvious discrimination," David explained, drawing diagrams on the whiteboard. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels they can succeed." His words carried the weight of experience, but also hope for the future. Principal Richardson had transformed her office into an open forum, scheduling regular meetings with student representatives and parents. The walls, once decorated with academic awards and sports trophies, now featured student artwork celebrating diversity and inclusion. A suggestion box outside her door overflowed with ideas from the student body. In the teacher's lounge, a transformation was also underway. Mr. Rodriguez led weekly discussion groups where educators could honestly examine their own biases and teaching practices. "We're not here to shame anyone," he reminded his colleagues. "We're here to grow and become better educators for all our students." The physics class, now led by Ms. Carter, a young teacher who had been serving as a substitute, brought a fresh energy to the subject. She made a point of connecting physics concepts to diverse scientists and real-world applications from various cultures. Students who had previously felt intimidated now eagerly participated in discussions. One morning, David arrived early to find a letter in his locker. It was from Mrs. Thompson, who was halfway through her leave of absence. "Your dignity in the face of my behavior taught me more than any training course could," she wrote. "I'm working hard to understand my biases and become the teacher every student deserves." The school board had taken notice of Roosevelt's transformation. At their monthly meeting, they unanimously approved a district-wide initiative based on the Roosevelt Pledge. Dr. Johnson, invited as a keynote speaker, shared how the incident had sparked a movement larger than anyone expected. What happened in that physics class could have ended in anger and division, he told the packed auditorium. Instead, it became a catalyst for unity and progress. Our children showed us the way forward. The board members listened intently as he outlined the changes already taking place at Roosevelt. Back at school, the changes were visible in small but significant ways. The cafeteria, once informally segregated by social groups, now featured mixed tables where students from different backgrounds shared lunches and stories. Study groups became more diverse, with students actively seeking out different perspectives on their subjects. Priya's newspaper team continued documenting the transformation. Their latest issue featured interviews with alumni who shared similar experiences from their school days, contrasting them with the positive changes now taking place. The story had evolved from exposing a problem to chronicling a solution. Chen Wei's parents, both educators in China, visited the school to observe the changes. They were so impressed that they began developing a cultural exchange program between Roosevelt and their school in Shanghai. Education should build bridges, not walls, Chen Wei's father remarked during his visit. The impact spread beyond Roosevelt's walls. Other schools in the district began implementing similar programs. Student leaders from neighboring schools visited to learn from Roosevelt's experience. David and his fellow council members found themselves mentoring other students on how to create positive change in their own schools. One afternoon, during a council meeting, Riley shared some surprising news. "Remember how we thought this might hurt our college applications?" she said. "Actually, universities are reaching out to us. They want to know more about what we're doing here." Several colleges had expressed interest in Roosevelt's approach to promoting inclusive education. The changes weren't without challenges. Some parents worried the focus on social issues might detract from academic excellence. The council addressed these concerns by showing how inclusive education improved learning outcomes for all students. Test scores and class participation had actually increased since the changes began. David's physics grades remained excellent, but he found himself learning far more than equations and formulas. In a journal entry for his English class, he wrote, "Science teaches us that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. But sometimes, a negative action can spark a positive reaction far greater than anyone imagined." As the first month of changes drew to a close, Principal Richardson organized a town hall meeting to assess the progress. Parents, teachers, and students filled the auditorium, sharing stories of transformation. A freshman spoke about feeling welcomed for the first time in his school career. A senior discussed how the changes had altered her college essay plans, shifting her focus to community leadership. The evening ended with a surprise announcement. The State Department of Education had selected Roosevelt High as a pilot school for a new initiative promoting inclusive education. The program would provide additional resources and support for the changes already underway. Outside the auditorium, David found himself standing with Chen Wei and Priya, watching the sunset through the school's windows. "You know what's really amazing?" Priya said, her reporter's notebook finally closed. "This isn't just about fixing what was wrong. We're creating something entirely new." Chen Wei nodded in agreement. "In Chinese, we have a saying, a crisis is an opportunity riding the dangerous wind. This whole experience proves that's true." David looked at his friends, then back at the crowded hallway where students and teachers chatted easily, barriers broken down by their shared commitment to change. "The best part," he said quietly, "is that this is just the beginning." 2 months after the incident, Roosevelt High hosted its first educational equity conference. The school gymnasium had been transformed into a professional conference space, with students serving as organizers, speakers, and moderators. Educators and administrators from across the state filled the bleachers, eager to learn from what the media had dubbed the Roosevelt Revolution. David stood at the podium, his initial nervousness giving way to confidence as he addressed the crowd. "When I walked into physics class that morning, I was just thinking about quantum mechanics," he began, earning gentle laughter from the audience. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today, talking to educators about transforming our school system." The conference featured student-led workshops on creating inclusive classrooms, panels with education experts, and presentations from teachers about their experiences implementing change. Chen Wei's cultural exchange program had already connected Roosevelt with schools in 3 different countries, and their representatives attended virtually, sharing their perspectives through live video feeds. During a break between sessions, Priya interviewed Dr. Lisa Chen, the state education commissioner, for the school newspaper. "What's remarkable about Roosevelt's approach," Dr. Chen observed, "is how it balances accountability with growth. This isn't about punishment, it's about progress." The most powerful moment came during a panel featuring Mrs. Thompson, who had returned to teaching after completing her training. Her voice steady but humble, she shared her journey of confronting and addressing her own biases. "My greatest lesson came not from any training manual," she said, "but from watching how my students handled this situation with maturity and grace." In the audience, David's parents sat with other family members who had traveled to attend the conference. Dr. Johnson wiped away tears as he watched his son facilitate a discussion about creating safe spaces for difficult conversations. His wife squeezed his hand, both of them proud of how their son had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for positive change. The conference attracted unexpected attention. Tech companies sent representatives to learn about creating inclusive workplaces. Civil rights organizations offered internships to student council members. Local businesses pledged support for Roosevelt's new initiatives, creating scholarships and mentorship programs. During lunch, David found himself sharing a table with educators from his old elementary school. They were implementing similar changes in their classrooms, reaching younger students before biases could take root. "Your story made us realize we can't wait until high school to address these issues," his former principal explained. The afternoon sessions focused on practical implementation. Riley and her team presented data showing improved academic performance across all student demographics since the changes began. "When students feel valued and respected," she explained, "they're more likely to engage with the material and succeed." Priya's newspaper team had set up a multimedia display in the hallway, documenting the school's transformation through photos, videos, and student testimonials. Visitors lingered there between sessions, many wiping away tears as they read stories of personal growth and transformation. Chen Wei's presentation on international perspectives drew particular interest. He showed how different cultures approach inclusive education, suggesting ways to incorporate global best practices into American classrooms. "Education should be a bridge between cultures," he emphasized, "not a barrier." The day took an unexpected turn when a group of students from a neighboring city shared their own story. Inspired by Roosevelt's example, they had successfully advocated for change in their school district. "Watching your video showed us it was possible to speak up and be heard," their student body president explained. As the conference continued, Principal Richardson received news that would change everything. The State Board of Education had unanimously voted to adopt Roosevelt's model as a template for schools across the state. The Roosevelt Standards for Inclusive Education would become part of teacher training programs at major universities. During the closing session, David shared the stage with students from other schools who had started their own initiatives. Together, they represented a new generation of education advocates, committed to creating classrooms where every student could thrive. "Change doesn't happen in isolation," David told the audience. "It happens when we recognize our shared humanity and commit to supporting each other's growth." He gestured to his fellow student leaders, each representing a different school, different background, different story. "This is just the beginning of a much larger conversation." The day ended with an impromptu gathering in the school courtyard. As the sun set, students, teachers, and visitors mingled, sharing stories and contact information. Plans were made for future collaborations, mentorships, and exchange programs. Mrs. Thompson approached David as the crowd began to disperse. "I want you to know," she said softly, that you've not only changed this school, you've changed lives. Including mine. They shared a moment of understanding, both recognizing how far they'd come from that morning in physics class. Later that evening, as the cleaning crew cleared the last chairs from the gymnasium, David sat with his friends in their usual spot in the library. Priya was already writing her article about the conference, while Chen-Wei coordinated with international partners via video chat. Riley reviewed the day's feedback forms, noting ideas for future improvements. "You know what amazes me?" David said, looking around at his friends. "This all started with one moment, one classroom, one incident. But it's grown into something so much bigger than any of us." Principal Richardson, passing by with the last of the conference guests, overheard his comment. She paused in the doorway. "That's how real change happens," she said. "Not from top-down mandates, but from people coming together to say, we can do better." As night fell over Roosevelt High, the impact of the day's events was already spreading through social media, educational networks, and personal conversations. What had started as a painful incident in one classroom had evolved into a movement, inspiring schools and communities across the country to examine their own practices and commit to positive change. 6 months after the conference, Roosevelt High was preparing for graduation. The school halls buzzed with a different energy now, one of purpose and pride. College acceptance letters had started arriving, and the class of 2025 had achieved the highest admission rate in the school's history. But the real success stories went far beyond numbers and statistics. David sat in his new favorite spot, the recently established Student Achievement Center, a space that had once been an unused storage room. Now it was a vibrant hub where students from all backgrounds gathered to study, mentor each other, and work on community projects. The walls were covered with college pennants, student artwork, and inspirational quotes in multiple languages. "Remember when we thought this would all blow over?" Priya said, looking up from her laptop where she was finishing her final editorial for the school paper. Her articles about Roosevelt's transformation had won state journalism awards, and she'd earned a full scholarship to study journalism at Northwestern University. Chen-Wei nodded, adjusting the video conference screen where students from partner schools in Shanghai, Lagos, and Sao Paulo joined their weekly international student forum. "My parents say our school back home is completely different now. They're using our model to create their own inclusive education program." The Roosevelt model, as it had come to be known, had spread far beyond their small community. Educational consultants regularly visited to study their approach, and a documentary crew had spent the past month filming for a special about transforming education in America. But the real stories of change were in the small, daily moments that cameras couldn't capture. In Mrs. Thompson's classroom, yes, she had returned to teaching, a new tradition had taken root. Every Friday, students shared appreciation moments, acknowledging someone who had supported their learning journey. The practice had spread to other classrooms, creating a culture of gratitude and recognition that transformed the school atmosphere. Principal Richardson had just returned from a national education conference in Washington, D.C., where she presented Roosevelt's data to Congress. The numbers were impressive. Disciplinary incidents had dropped by 78%, attendance had improved by 23%, and academic performance showed significant gains across all demographic groups. But as she often said, the statistics tell only part of the story. The real story was in students like Anthony, a freshman who had struggled with dyslexia and anxiety. In the old system, he might have fallen through the cracks. Now, thanks to the peer mentoring program David helped establish, Anthony was thriving, even starting a support group for other students with learning differences. One afternoon, as David helped Anthony with physics homework, a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Thompson, carrying a stack of graded papers, paused to watch them work. The scene represented everything that had changed, a senior helping a freshman, the former incident transformed into a moment of growth for everyone involved. "David," she called softly. "I have something to show you." She handed him a letter from the State Board of Education. The Thompson-Johnson Initiative, named after both teacher and student, would provide funding for other schools to implement similar transformation programs. "They want us both to be advisors," she explained, her eyes bright with emotion. The initiative would ensure that what happened at Roosevelt wasn't just a one-time response to a single incident. It would become a sustainable model for educational reform, complete with training programs, resources, and ongoing support for schools nationwide. Riley, who had been accepted to several Ivy League schools, chose instead to attend a state university where she could work directly with the initiative. "Why go somewhere else to study education reform when we're creating it right here?" she explained during her graduation speech. The impact extended beyond education. Local businesses had taken notice of Roosevelt's approach to inclusion and began implementing similar programs in their workplaces. The city council adopted elements of the Roosevelt model for their public service training. Even the local police department requested workshops on bias awareness and community engagement. One day, as David walked through the halls during passing period, he noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. A group of students, different grades, different backgrounds, were clustered around a physics problem, excitedly discussing quantum mechanics. No one was worried about who belonged in the conversation, they were simply engaged in learning together. The school's transformation had even influenced college admissions practices. Several universities had revised their application processes after seeing how Roosevelt's holistic approach to student assessment revealed talents and potential that standardized tests missed. The Common Application added a new essay prompt about creating positive change in one's community, inspired by Roosevelt students' experiences. As graduation approached, David worked with the Student Diversity Council to ensure their initiatives would continue after the senior class departed. They created detailed handbooks, mentored younger students, and established connections with middle schools to create a pipeline of engaged student leaders. The local newspaper ran a feature comparing Roosevelt, then and now, including interviews with alumni who had graduated before the changes. Many expressed amazement at the transformation. "It's like a different world," one former student commented. "But it's the world we always needed school to be." Dr. Johnson, speaking at a medical conference, shared how the Roosevelt experience had influenced his approach to training new doctors. "My son's story taught me that change isn't just about policies and procedures," he told his colleagues. "It's about creating environments where everyone can thrive." One evening, as David finished his last physics tutoring session of the year, he found Priya in the newspaper office, surrounded by old articles and photos. "I'm creating an archive," she explained. "Future students should know how this all started, and more importantly, how we kept it going." The archive would include not just news articles and official documents, but personal stories, journal entries, and reflections from students and teachers. It would show how a moment of confronting bias had evolved into a sustainable movement for educational equity. As the sun set over Roosevelt High, casting long shadows through the hallways, David walked past the physics classroom one last time. The equation he had tried to answer on that fateful day was still visible in the corner of the whiteboard, preserved as a reminder. But now it was surrounded by student projects, collaborative work, and evidence of a learning community where everyone belonged. "You know what's amazing?" he said to Chun-Wei, who had joined him for the walk. "We didn't just change a school. We showed that change is possible anywhere, if people are willing to do the work." Chun-Wei smiled, pointing to the school's new motto, painted above the main entrance, "Every voice matters, every mind counts." Below it, in smaller letters, the Roosevelt promise, "Because change starts here." Graduation day at Roosevelt High School dawned bright and clear. The morning sun illuminated the football field where chairs were arranged in neat rows, each bearing a blue ribbon, the same color that had united the school community months ago. But today, the blue represented something more. The legacy of change that would continue long after the class of 2025 moved on. As students gathered in the gymnasium to line up, the atmosphere was electric with excitement and nostalgia. David adjusted his valedictorian medals, including a new one created this year, the Roosevelt Champion of Change Award. He wasn't the only recipient. The award had been given to every student, teacher, and staff member who had contributed to the school's transformation. Hard to believe it all started with a physics question, Chen Wei said, straightening his honor cords. He would be heading to MIT in the fall, where he'd already been invited to join a research group studying educational equity in STEM fields. Now look at us, we're literally rewriting education textbooks. Priya rushed over, camera in hand, documenting every moment for both the school paper and the official archive. She'd received offers from major newspapers to share their story but had chosen to give the exclusive to the school's journalism program. Future students need to hear this story from us, she'd explained. Principal Richardson gathered the graduating class for one final address before the ceremony. When you walk across that stage today, she said, her voice carrying emotion, you're not just receiving diplomas. You're carrying forward a legacy of courage, compassion, and change. The ceremony itself was unlike any graduation Roosevelt had seen before. The traditional pomp and circumstance was followed by an original composition created by the music department, featuring melodies from the diverse cultural backgrounds represented in the student body. The school choir performed in multiple languages, a testament to the international connections fostered over the past year. From the podium, David surveyed the crowd. Education officials from across the country sat alongside local families. Television cameras captured the moment for national news. But his eyes found Mrs. Thompson, sitting with the faculty, wearing a blue blazer and a proud smile. 1 year ago, David began his valedictorian speech, I stood in a classroom feeling invisible. Today, I stand here seeing every single person in our school community. Really seeing them. And being seen. He paused, letting his words sink in. But this isn't just about being seen. It's about what we choose to do once we truly see each other. He shared stories of transformation, how the freshman chess club now included students from every background, how the science fair had doubled in participation, how the school's first mental health awareness week had created lasting support systems. These changes didn't happen because of one incident, he emphasized. They happened because an entire community chose to learn, grow, and act. As he spoke, screens displayed photos and videos from the year. Students tutoring each other in the Achievement Center, international video conferences with partner schools, community outreach programs, and countless small moments of connection and support. Mrs. Thompson took the stage next, her presence drawing supportive applause. Teaching for 25 years taught me a lot, she said, but this past year taught me even more. True education isn't just about what we know, it's about how we grow. She announced her new role as the district's first director of educational equity, ensuring Roosevelt's model would spread to other schools. The ceremony continued with a series of presentations highlighting the year's achievements. Riley shared data from the Thompson-Johnson initiative's first implementation in neighboring schools. Chen Wei announced the expansion of the International Partnership Program to 12 more countries. Priya presented the first copy of The Roosevelt Story to the school library, a comprehensive account of their journey. As diplomas were handed out, each graduate received something extra, a small blue pin bearing the words, "Change starts here." The pins had been designed by Anthony, the freshman David had mentored, who was now preparing to lead the Student Diversity Council in the coming year. Dr. Johnson, watching his son accept his diploma, remembered their conversation from months ago about success being the best response to prejudice. But what they'd achieved was more than success, it was transformation. The physics classroom where it all began had become a symbol of possibility, its door always open to students seeking help or hoping to help others. After the ceremony, as families and friends celebrated on the field, David noticed a group of students from a nearby middle school watching with interest. They wore blue ribbons of their own, already preparing to carry the Roosevelt legacy forward when they started high school in the fall. Principal Richardson gathered the graduating class for one final photo. As the photographer counted down, David looked at his classmates, not just friends, but fellow architects of change. Chen Wei, whose international perspective had broadened their horizons. Priya, whose journalism had given voice to their story. Riley, whose leadership had turned ideas into action. And countless others who had contributed in their own unique ways. The flash captured more than just smiling faces in caps and gowns. It captured a moment in time when a group of young people proved that education could be transformed through courage, compassion, and commitment to change. Later that evening, at the graduation party in the school gymnasium, David found himself back in the physics classroom one last time. The equation he'd tried to answer that fateful day had been preserved in a small frame, surrounded by photographs documenting the year's journey. Mrs. Thompson joined him there, both of them reflecting on how far they'd come. "You know," she said softly, "quantum physics teaches us that observing something changes it. But what we learned this year is that truly seeing each other changes everything." As they walked back to the party, David paused in the hallway. The walls were lined with college acceptance letters, awards, and pictures of student achievements. But more importantly, they showed hundreds of small moments of connection, support, and growth. "Our story isn't over," David told the documentary crew filming the celebration. "Every student who walks through these doors becomes part of it. Every teacher who questions their assumptions adds to it. Every person who chooses to speak up when they see injustice continues it." The night ended with a new tradition, the passing of the torch. Senior members of the Student Diversity Council officially handed their roles to the next generation of leaders. Anthony, accepting his new position, spoke with confidence about plans for the coming year. As the class of 2025 stepped into their future, they carried with them more than memories and diplomas. They carried the knowledge that change is possible, that every voice matters, and that education can be transformed when people come together with courage and commitment. The Roosevelt Revolution, as it came to be known, had started with one moment in one classroom. But its legacy would continue in countless classrooms, schools, and communities across the country, a reminder that sometimes the greatest lessons come not from textbooks, but from the courage to stand up, speak out, and work together for change.